Our first guest is one of the most credible voices in LTL freight, and his track record speaks for itself. He spent 8 years at Old Dominion across operations, warehousing, and pricing, then went on to lead LTL pricing and services across three managed transportation providers. He's the founder of ULTL, the industry's first community for hands-on LTL education, with over 300 professionals and growing strong. He advises some of the most ambitious freight tech companies out there, including a top 5 carrier on their pricing infrastructure. Today, he's the co-founder and CEO of Lateral, a pricing to routing coordination layer for carriers, shippers, and brokers, and the home of Rate Hero and ShipTest. He reigns from British Columbia, but now is converted to South Carolina. Curtis Garrett, welcome.
Wow, thank you. I was sitting here thinking, who is this guest?
Okay, so what I like about having you on the show, besides getting to hang out, is that the focus is on the distribution network, and obviously LTL freight is such a huge part of distribution. You know, I've kind of been saying, I think I'm oversimplifying it, that distribution is buy, store, sell, ship, you know, maybe in different orders, but broadly that's going to be the order. And shipping is such a key component. We use the word freight to describe obviously what's happening, but freight is the product. It's the thing that's actually moving, right? It's the promise that's moving. So I sometimes think even using the term freight is almost, it sort of like cheapens what you're not what you're doing, but with freight. I mean, we're obviously into freight too. Like, it's just, I think the term is almost undersells what it is. I wish there was a better way to say we're moving the promise, or, you know, to the customer. It's such a critical component. I think that's, you know, maybe obvious, but I had to get it out of the way. So I would ask that for someone running a distribution business, how does LTL pricing actually work today, and where does it consistently break down for the shipper?
Yeah, and not to get too deep right away, but if you really think about that, depending on who you're asking it does carry a different meaning. Like if you ask an LTL carrier, they think of the space on their trailers and the capacity that they're selling for said items to fit into so they can move them through their network. If you're talking to the customer, the distributor, whoever's tendering the shipment for pickup, like freight is this book I have on my desk or this water bottle, you know, it's the actual product itself that's being moved. So yeah, that is kind of interesting to nerd out on. LTL pricing, and this is my favorite topic to talk about. There's so many levels to it, like from the market itself and who might have pricing power, whether it's the carriers or the shippers. It's not this simple supply and demand, you know, pendulum. Like there's so many different hinges to it. And there's a lot of micro LTLisms that might be happening. And really, we've seen a ton of that in the last few years with Yellow going out of business, a huge carrier in the market. Even later that year, when Estes was hit with a cyber attack and they were basically dark for almost a month, you know, that took another major carrier out of the market. And so regardless of what was happening in the macro economy or even in the truckload freight market, LTL has these little microcosms of the pure LTL market can look and feel very different depending on what's really happening on our turf. So if I'm a distributor, I think where a lot of the disconnect comes into play is most shippers are thinking about LTL pricing in terms of the dollar amount. When I log into my carrier's website or into my TMS or wherever I pull my LTL pricing, I know I need to put in some shipment level details and get a price. And then I probably have prices from other providers, other carriers, and I'm going to compare to that and look at the all-in dollar amount and then the carrier's promise in a way by way of like their transit time, their expected speed or velocity of picking up and delivering my freight. But when you go, if you are that person at a distributor that is responsible for getting the best carriers in play and getting the best possible or the most fair price for the level of service, it kind of converts to this whole different language. And then you're up at this LTL pricing framework level where you're talking which rate base do you want to use and which fuel schedule. And, you know, down here in the US, what are the discounts and minimum charges that are going to be essentially applied against that rate base? Different accessorial structures. A lot of shippers don't know that there's kind of a whole menu of different components that they can choose and plug and play. And one choice might affect something in another category. If you do really push for a lower fuel schedule to keep your fuel surcharges down, then that might drive up the price of some of your accessorials or your line haul, like your core freight charge. That's where I think we have a lot of work to do as an industry just to simplify not the quoting piece necessarily. I think that will always somewhat remain what it is. You need shipment level details. The carrier needs to understand the attributes of the shipment, how much space it's going to take up, how much it weighs, what services are needed, the speed of transit needed. That's kind of the order taking level, like to give the right price at the right time. But something we can keep really evolving. And I think it's really early on the broad spectrum of antiquated, complex LTL pricing to simple, easy to understand, like high user experience LTL pricing, that understanding and negotiating and setting up the right program for your freight, if that makes sense.
It does. And you kind of made me think of something there. It's like, you're not just trying to, to optimize your operations that are conducive to helping a carrier optimize theirs are going to ultimately lead to better rates. I just feel like that kind of like cheapens what I'm saying, but you're effectively saying like there's a disconnect between how carriers like to operate, how they make money, what's good for their business. And I feel like there's a bit of a divorce in knowledge between the distributor, going back to your point, of like you're just looking at the rate on the sheet. It's understanding the inputs that got to that rate. And there are things that you can do as a business that are beneficial to your carrier partners that will actually be net benefit to you from a rating perspective downstream if you can kind of do those things and understand what those things are. I think it's really important to know from the distributor side of things, with the millions of things they need to do, understanding how LTL works. I've made a career out of it, and I think sometimes I still don't know all the things, so it's a lot to ask almost in a way too, isn't it?
Yeah, it starts with understanding that not every shipper out there needs to have a degree in LTL and know all the intricacies of all of their carriers, networks, and operations, but some level of understanding and just how LTL differentiates from parcel and truckload and drayage and rail and other modes. One quick example, it's kind of a funny story. I was working with a shipper years ago that gave a lot of volume to one specific LTL carrier, enough that carrier had 2 drop trailers at the shipper's warehouse at any given time. And most days they would completely fill up those 2 trailers. So this shipper, we quickly realized, and this came through kind of cries of help from the carrier. Hey, can you talk to them? Can you try to educate them a little further? They thought they were doing the carrier a favor by playing Tetris and mixing and matching and basically trying to fill that trailer up as much as they could, double stacking where they could. If they had a 3 pallet order and 2 of the pieces fit better on trailer A, they'd stick those 2 pieces there and then the last one on trailer B. And in their mind, they thought this freight was traveling on those trailers,
Right.
from A to B. And so it wasn't funny at the time, but looking back, that carrier had a service center literally 2 miles down the road. So they would send a driver or 2 every day to do the trailer pickup and swap and everything, leave another empty. They'd have to take both trailers back, wait until they kind of had a slower dock time later in the evening, and then just strip both trailers, dump all that freight to the dock, and then go through with paperwork and try to mix and match and find the right shipment so that they could then, load them on all the right outgoing trailers to different destinations across the country.
Yeah.
So what was intended as a favor of sorts turned into probably quadruple the origin cross-dock time that carrier had to execute just in order to get that original pickup stripped, unloaded, and then reconsolidated with other like shipments going to similar destinations. So that's a key knowledge point to understand is whatever trailer you're loading at origin is not going to be the unit that delivers that freight 2,000 miles away or even 500 miles away.
Yeah.
It's very much, a heavily leveraged network, hub and spoke network for the most part, with direct runs, and every carrier wants to touch their customers' shipments as few times as possible. So I live in Greensboro now. If a carrier here picks up freight, they're going to load as much of that direct to Atlanta or direct to, Orlando or whatever as they have the volume and density for, so they don't have to ping pong down through, Charlotte and Greenville and all these other cities and kind of, unload and load again. It's not good for anybody. It's more time and work for them, and it's more touch points and opportunities for damage for the customers. So things like that go a long way. And I think pricing in LTL is obviously about what you're going to pay the provider, but there's so much from the ground level and the operational landscape that is connected there. And one thing I've always said is when you think about an LTL carrier's costs, and that's an important subject because we don't see like software type pricing and willingness to pay and 60% margins in the LTL space, right? It's the true challenge for most carriers is establish and quantify their costs on a single account and then make a very slim margin above that. If they're making 15 to 20%, that's pretty good for an LTL carrier. So when you think about their costs, and a lot of these are impacted by shipper behavior, by their customers, they all roll up to either space, time, or risk. I can think of probably 100 plus different LTL factors that drive cost, whether it's stuff administratively, whether it's the type of location they're picking up or delivering at, residential versus commercial, whether it's activities and things going on the cross dock, they all boil down to either space, time, or some sort of risk. So when you understand it that way, and that's what I've tried to do throughout my career is kind of distill this kind of complex stuff down where there are a lot of moving parts and a lot of variables into this kind of first principles like framework or mental framework for thinking about something. It becomes a lot easier to understand it.
I'm thinking about that story of the really well-intentioned trailer packing, and it's like, it is one of those, I don't know, I feel like this feels almost more philosophical, but sometimes we just need to ask. Sometimes it's like having that the awareness, the curiosity to say, how can we help? What could we do to make this better for you? And maybe in some ways it requires to have a bit of a long view and a more holistic view of the world to say, like, this may not show up today in our rates, but what can we do that will maybe have a long tail benefit to the operability of the companies and our partners that makes life better for them, which ultimately should come back on us. If you have some belief in karma, at least to a degree, you might think of that philosophically, but quite literally as well, that the distributor can do to make themselves more operationally attractive. It's just net going to have a better impact.
Yeah. If they go to their carrier and say, how can we reduce the space that our freight occupies on your dock and in your trailers? How can we reduce the time you're spending to pick up, cross dock, deliver, and kind of service our account? And how can we reduce your risk? I can guarantee that will kickstart a series of conversations that will lead to better pricing.
100%. Well said. All right. So economy's weird. I think it's in a bad place. Every distributor I'm talking to right now, they've got really I can almost preempt it in any call. They've got two major issues they're dealing with almost categorically right now. It's what I'll call sort of margin pressure, which I think ultimately creates a bit of margin leakage. So one and the same thing. It's like hidden margin, hidden cost. Where is it? And then just downward pressure from the market. And then customer experience. These are kind of the things about, and to me, that's a sign of getting deeper with our customers, creating better customer experience, expanding share of wallets. Customer acquisition right now is very expensive. It's going to be increasingly so. So how can we just be vertically integrated with our customers from at least even just a mind share and a brand perspective? Keeping those things in mind, freight is obviously one of the larger line items in a business. What can a shipper actually control? There's a lot of these things are out of their hands. They can't change fuel prices. It's not their fault that Iran is happening. So and maybe this is kind of just pulling in from what we were just talking about, but maybe like in sort of a practical, punchy way, like what can shippers do to help their own cause?
Honestly, I would lead with really being aware of and actively controlling what they can control. Because you're right that from different economic factors and fuel prices and even the carrier's behavior, I could be a distributor that does a lot of business with a certain carrier. That carrier decides to expand and open a new terminal or a region. And now that changes how things are routed and they're trying to, push more density to that new facility. And that's totally out of my control. But controlling what you can control, which includes being educated and aware of how an LTL network functions and what that looks like, what you can impact and what you can't. Looking at LTL like a long-term investment is something that I like to talk to shippers about, where again, so much of how truckload works kind of creeps into the LTL space, and really very much so for a lot of shippers. And I get it. Like it's understandable. If you look at a typical mid-market shipper, they might have 20 or 30 million in truckload and 2 to 5 in LTLs. Like it always is kind of the little step brother, stepsister of these other larger modes. But that creeps in from how bids and pricing is done, how routing choices are made, how relationships are managed with their carriers. And a lot of shippers are very quick to just say, oh, there's a failure there. Let's pull them out, get somebody in, not realizing that there's a very small number of relevant LTL carriers to choose from. So I think, generally speaking, if most shippers would think about their LTL, like vendor management and procurement and routing decisions, more so like they do the parcel side versus the truckload side, I think they'd be in a much better spot. The things they can control and invest in, and this is something I do when I help shippers with RFPs, like we're not just sending shipment data and all the essentials that you typically think of with a pricing exercise. I ask them to take pictures of their dock and their facility. And if they have a scale or a dimensioner, take a picture of that. I'm going to include that in the RFP to the carriers. If they have any, safety mechanisms like the locks, when a trailer backs into a dock door, just really anything that can kind of highlight and show them off as a shipper of choice that's investing in their freight. And all that stuff pays dividends in the long run. So the weird thing about LTL pricing, or really the market, is there's no single index. There's no DAT for LTL. Like nobody really knows, we've got the federal PPI, we've got the different CAS indices, and there's this like LTL adjacent stuff that can throw a few signals as far as who really has the pricing power, but there's no just singular mass like thermometer or nowhere to turn to that says, hey, going into this pricing conversation, I know the carrier has the upper hand, and that's all there is to it, and I'll be happy to get out of it with X. So it comes down to the narrative and who can tell the better story about who's got more leverage in the market. And the LTL carriers are very good at telling the story about their rising costs, and for good reason. Like if I think today in 2026, if you look at your average LTL carrier in the top 35 or 40 carrier base versus even your top LTL shippers, by volume, let's say, the LTL carrier has this souped up exotic supercar with all that they've invested in with technology and tooling and hardware and capabilities compared to what the average shipper has, who might not even be using a TMS in some cases, might just be, paper routing, and they've got a map on the wall of, hey, if it's going to this state, we give it to this carrier. And there's obviously exceptions to that, but all in all, most shippers right now in today's day are less sophisticated at LTL than the carriers are.
Yeah.
So I think that has to kind of even up a little bit. I think the shippers need to catch up, which I do see some signs of. Our friend Scooter Sayers is out there. He'll sell a shipper a dimensioner in a heartbeat. So there's hardware and tools and all these things that unlock capabilities, kind of shifting a little more to the shipper's way. But honestly, that's how I'd answer this question: is what can I invest in and implement and, onboard in as a shipper in my LTL program that will allow me to get better, more accurate, clear data to my carrier partners further upstream in the process, so they can plan better, so they're not getting surprises. What will allow me to tender and put, nice, clean, well-protected freight on strong pallets that are not made of plasterboard or styrofoam or whatever, and are going to disintegrate as soon as the forklift touches it. Just all these little things that do hit the P&L of a distributor as higher cost. But if you don't cut corners there, you are going to have significantly better carrier relationships and better, more consistent pricing in the long run.
So what does getting freight cheaper actually look like in practice? What are the shippers with real leverage doing that most harm?
I think it's a bit of a perception shift, and what cheap or valuable freight services as far as the bang for the buck and the ROI and what you're paying. I think you have to pull back and not just look at that upfront rate. You could have the same shipper that has pricing with 10 carriers, and at that snapshot in time, each one is going to put a different price in front of that same shipper to haul that same shipment. You've got to look at the total end-to-end cost, and things like the next most obvious thing there is just the shipment exceptions. Like, how much damage are you getting? How many missed deliveries, missed pickups, things that do add cost. And items like that are a little easier to quantify in the retail and grocery space, because a late shipment usually means a fine or something monetary that hurts and stings from that consignee that kind of carries the bigger bad in that relationship. But even for, B2B and folks in the industrial, non-retail, non-grocery markets, service and reliability and connectivity and getting the right information from the right carrier by way of API integrations. And not every carrier is equal on all of these different things. So really figuring out first what's important to you. There are shippers that don't care if it gets there in 7 days versus 10 days or whatever. Their customers are fine. It's not just in time, on demand type stuff. And so they can cut a corner there, and they can use a cheaper, longer haul carrier that might be able to offer them lower rates because they are holding trailers in order to fill them before they move them and things like that. So it's just, you've got to know what you need, what your requirements are, what you're not willing to give up on, and kind of those constraints on that side. And then choose the right carrier and have a full end-to-end value calculator or model. Even things like solving the inevitable problems that come up with LTL, whether it is an invoice discrepancy, whether it's some sort of operational or, routing and delivery error, you've got to know and understand that those same problems are much easier to solve with some carriers because of the way they've set up their customer service network. Like, recent example, Saia, a top 5 or 6 LTL carrier down here, they recently just changed from, instead of centralized call centers for customer service, they have put that role back into the terminals, which is something that Old Dominion, for example, has always had. And that's one key way that an LTL customer can kind of feel like they're getting direct to the source. They're dealing with, a smaller company, and they're not getting routed through all these layers of just people answering phones and call centers. So if I have a pallet missing, my customer calls me, hey, we got 2 out of 3 pallets, and I've got to essentially solve that mystery. I can now call the terminal for Saia and talk to somebody that can literally go out and walk the dock and put eyes on, where my freight might be.
So I'm glad you called that specific example out, because again, in my just career in the space, like, that is such a huge advantage. And I think it's one of the things that really has really for carriers is that those sort of levels of what would have historically been pretty mid to poor kind of customer experience. So thinking more critically about that access, and, kind of in a world where we're trying to move towards more and more scale and automation and all these types of things. And, I'm as much as anybody trying to, make a living off of these products. I also deeply believe in technology when you want it, people when you don't. And there's a component to a level of sometimes you just need to talk to somebody, and somebody who's actually gives you that sense of access to information is very cathartic. And so I love that play on Saia. I didn't know that. So I'm really, I didn't know Old Dominion had always done it that way. And God, they just continue to be like the winner. It's so good, and just straight up.
Yeah.
So
yeah, my rough, bar set is like, dealing with your LTL carrier, especially on those problems or issues, shouldn't feel like you're dealing with government.
Yeah.
And a lot of times there still are some carriers in the market where it does, and you're just, 10 email responses deep on a thread before you get to the meat of the problem, or, 3 holds on a phone call. And then there's others that they're very good at just matching you up with the person that can solve your problem and getting that fixed.
Good for them. And it is harder as businesses get bigger. Yeah, there's so many things that are preventing that type of experience. So it takes a real effort to build simplicity is very hard. And so building towards something like that is actually quite challenging. So most distribution leaders think about freight from one direction. What's this going to cost me? But the carriers are evaluating the two and being more selective. And most shippers have no idea how they're showing up on that side of the table. So what does a shipper need to look like for favorable treatment from carriers today?
Yeah. There's a couple levels to this. Some things, and really goes back to shippers being aware of what they can control and controlling those things. Geography, as far as like where their facilities or their warehouses are located in proximity to either major markets or just specific carrier terminals, that is going to be a factor on getting predictable, reliable service and lessening like the missed pickup experience, what they're shipping. If I'm in the flagpole business and that's what my grandfather started making and selling, and I'm just entrenched in that, I'm not going to just change products or change industries, but I have to know that's a less than ideal freight profile for your average LTL carrier. So certain things like that, it's kind of like they do impact the experience and how carriers perceive those customers, but they may or may not be changeable. But then things like, again, back to reducing space, reducing time, reducing risk. Like, there's so many choices on what and how you package your freight. A big one is getting carriers in and out of your facility. And this is something that crops up a lot, on the retail and grocery side, where you have these massive distribution centers and there's all kinds of truckload and refrigerated and just all kinds of modes of domestic transportation moving in and out of these facilities. If they're able to get like a live unload or load door that gets the LTL carriers in and out, things like that, kind of keep in mind, like this is somebody that's running a route. It's not just like they drove 1,000 miles to see me and they're fine sitting for 8 hours until I can get to them. So that dwell time, like how much time are they spending on your lot compared to the actual activity time of offloading or picking up freight is a big one. The data quality, correct quote inputs, correct information on the bill of lading, using an electronic bill of lading, for example, instead of a paper bill of lading. Things like that are what carriers really look at. They're starting to do so more, and they do anytime the market tightens and they're getting crunched on the capacity side. They have to make choices. 2022 or 23, it was kind of like early to mid COVID. I remember, and this is well known, it's not a secret, but FedEx Freight, just one morning cut like 30 or 40, or it might have been more, but a lot of large, significant shippers that were causing them, high cost in operating and servicing their accounts, and debatable on how they did it and what the fallout of that going forward was, but it's a real thing. And if I'm a carrier that, like Old Dominion, XBO, Saia, some of these bigger carriers, Estes, they're out there picking up 40 to 80,000 shipments a day around the country. And so speed, getting freight out of their network and to the customer and getting it quickly into their network so it can just kind of enter that line haul network machine and start running, through the country is critical. And they can't get bogged down with driver A spending 3.5 hours waiting for a single pallet, at the customer. So yeah, just sensitivity, to the carrier's constraints by way of speed, by way of clean data, clean freight. Just be a clean shipper.
Do that, shippers. Clean it up.
Right.
Is there anything materially different, in terms of like maybe future pricing? I spent a little bit of time talking about this, recently in demo at ULTL. There was, some conversations specifically from Old Dominion around changing how things were being priced. So, I think back to, freight has, since I've been in this space for, about 20 years, speaking, both American and Canadian, quite frankly, freight hasn't changed. Are there any changes coming in the US pricing side in terms of how things are being done? You talked earlier about, making things more simple. Are we seeing steps in that direction?
Yeah, we definitely are. And when we're in the weeds of it every day and we're dealing with similar issues, day after day, week after week, it's sometimes hard to recognize that. But if I force myself to think just from a 3 to 5 year time frame. There's definitely changes, and a lot of them are for the better. So one of the big ones in the US market is the freight classification topic. And there's a lot of factors at play here. You've got this very solid, well-positioned, entity, the NMFTA, which is a trade organization that heavily they control and manage and decide what any commodity should be classified as, with input from shippers and carriers. It's not just they're not in a vacuum seeing how the wind's blowing and making decisions. They do study a lot of data and do reviews, and they go out to carrier docks and take samples and pictures. And so it is managed as well as it could be, I think, but I think it's just not working any longer. That's one of the huge, customer friction points, is just knowing, okay, I'm shipping this and I need to put this freight class number in order to get the correct price. So it's not a higher amount when I get the bill. And it's just such a steep learning curve. There's 7,000 plus different options, which on one hand is a lot. And when it used to be a book, I've got one on my shelf. Now it's a website. You're literally, back in the day, thumbing through this book, like, okay, here's my Yeti water bottle. There's under something that could be water bottle. There could be like 20 different options, and you have to look at the subtext and what's the material made out of. And just with the speed that the economy and commerce and products are evolving, there's just no feasible way that this entity can keep up with always having a relevant correlative classification for LTL with everything that exists out there that's being purchased and shipped. So that's got to go. Todd Poland from Old Dominion brought this up at the event. They've come out with a pretty slick cube tariff that doesn't consider class or commodity at all. It's just the accurate weight and dims of the freight. There's other carriers that do have those similar pricing frameworks. They're not widely used yet. I think OD is really a pioneer in kind of pushing that out there. Honestly, for them, it worked well. If you were to get their traditional blanket pricing, like if I'm a broker and I just want to get kind of general pricing that I can use for any of my customers, that level of that pricing is going to be a very high level cost or dollar amount from Old Dominion specifically. But that same, ability of being able to use Old Dominion pricing for any of my customers, if I'm signed up for this cube tariff and I'm giving accurate DIMS, it's like 10 to 30% cheaper, just in my experience. Like, just some of my customers have converted. So it's working out well for them. And there, a lot of water flowing through the pipes with customers using that. So the classification piece, I think accessorial charge structures don't make a lot of sense. I could see that being converted to time-based charges at some point in the future. You've got things like storage charges and detention that are already time. But if you think about it, if I order, a rower to my house or something like that, a good chance an LTL carrier is going to deliver it. I'm going to need a lift gate. I'm going to need, just inherently, because it's a home, they're going to hit me with a residential fee. They might add an appointment charge if somebody had to call ahead and make sure I'm going to be home at the right time. So you've got all these accessorials that tend to stack up and really add up. But at the end of the day, from a carrier cost perspective, it really just equates to time kind of out of route for the driver. He or she might have had their normal route with commercial locations they hit in a pretty high density footprint of the city. They've got to turn down my street and go into my neighborhood. So there's extra time and risk just getting to me. And then there's extra time and risk because you got to activate the lift gate and offload it and stick it in my garage. But all of that equates to time. Right now, most lift gates are driven based off the weight of the shipment, which doesn't make any sense, because you could have, a 2,000-pound item that takes up the same amount of space and really is the same handling time and investment for the driver to offload compared to a 200-pound box. And that heavy one is going to get an astronomical lift gate charge. So that things like that just don't make sense. It kind of reminds me of something else I've said in the past. The carrier costs, again, driven by time, space, and risk. The carrier revenue is driven largely by class and weight. And those two things don't align. And so that's why you have these really robust, complicated rules tariffs, which kind of operate as a duct tape to kind of connect those two together. And so I think having the rules tariffs in the future being a little more just kind of streamlined and in the background, like the T's and C's, and having the revenue and the way carriers quote to their customers better align with their true costs is the way to go. And I think we're heading there.
I felt at listening to folks at ULTL talk about this, there did seem to be a bit of apprehension on the carrier side too, being fearful that, well, if we go ahead and do this and our competitors don't, then we are creating more friction for the shipper. So I think that transitionary period could be, and Old Dominion does stand to be, I mean, they're big and they can kind of do, they have tended to be more of an industry leader and a trendsetter. So they were the right ones to lay that down for sure. And so I think that, the market would, I think it would be nice to see that. I hope that takes off. I hope that does well, because it definitely will be a much more beneficial way to do it. Now. I can say, being a Canadian and someone who spent a ton of time with Canadian LTL, it's not perfect. CWT pricing or hundredweight pricing has its challenges, and people freak out about here and they don't understand how cubing freight works and how, there's a bunch of weird math that also has to occur for you to be able to figure out how to do a rate. And I would say what's consistent in the Canadian market along with the US market is, broadly speaking, without software, no one has any idea how to calculate a freight rate. And even the software sometimes can be wrong because you may be selecting the wrong input. So you select the wrong class, or your software doesn't cube the freight to the roof and doesn't pick up the rule of the carrier. And one carrier says anything over 72 inches is the roof, anything over 60 is the roof, and all this weird carrier specific. Yeah. Some of this I think is going to have to be done through a larger room. And so what is something that is, would be easier to not solve alone? You know what I mean? What is something that about all this that we're talking about that would be easier to really just do as a community, or is going to take a community?
Almost all of it, I think. And that is a huge factor with the speed of change and progress that we've seen. Just the nature of the LTL industry on the carrier side being an oligopoly. And you're right. Nobody wants to be the highest or the lowest. Nobody wants to be the first or the last to do something. So you do have these front runners and you do have the laggards, but most of the market is kind of hanging out in this very homogenous, middle section. And it's almost funny, every carrier account rep or, salesperson, sounds the same. We're not going to be the cheapest, and we're higher service and quality. And they all kind of have the same talk track.
Yeah.
But the real life experience carrier to carrier is vastly different. So, I mean, one of my goals, moonshot goals that will take, I think as far as length of time, it'll take at least my whole career, and it will need a community, is just kind of Disney-fy the LTL experience. Just make it, hide the ugly stuff. You go to a Disney theme park, all the things that could be ugly and negative about a theme park experience, like the crowds and the trash and the smells, and you don't even notice it at Disney because they do such a good job just orchestrating all this stuff and having the right people and the right things in the right places. Honestly, they can run a transportation network like no other, their whole bus system and monorail and just the way they do things. So I would love kind of that high customer experience where the only thing you notice is the simplicity and the beauty of it. You don't really notice the rest of it. Another example, when I go to a hotel, I check in, I can pull up Netflix or something, and all it takes is scan a QR code, hit a button on my phone, and I'm instantly logged in and have my whole profile and watch history. And it's so easy and seamless. So stuff like that, from transmitting information electronically or through an eBOL, more information, not just the shipment itself, but stuff about that customer's profile and their needs, and just simplifying the pricing experience. I would say LTL carriers today, when it comes to the core of what they do and why they exist, getting a truck and trailer on site at a shipper, picking up physical freight, moving it through their system, getting it to where it needs to be and safely delivered intact, in the allotted amount of time. They are very, very good at that. And that's impressive. That's to ship a pallet from Miami to Seattle for $200 or $300. Like that's, that's marveling. Like that takes a large stack of real estate and technology and people and equipment, and it's pretty impressive. But I think where I'm focused is kind of the LTL CX and UX, and just making it, not disappear, but just making it a lot more representative of what it really is, which is an impressive, beautiful industry.
And the best UX is no UX, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I like it.
I mean, you preach that all the time. Yeah. It's
making it visible. And I think this is it. It's about really moving towards, I like to Disney. I haven't heard you say that before. I like that. But I think it's like, yeah, this industry has so much to gain from technology and data normalization. I feel that in terms of it's sort of the system to system. And I feel like there are a lot of areas that are going to experience great gains as a result of sort of technology that is just emerging now, or hasn't quite yet, but is about to. And maybe it's just because it's sort of confirmation bias is where I spend most of my time. But I can hardly think of any other industries that are going to benefit as much as this one, because it's a problem space that has just the right amount of fragmentation and fuckery to make it really, really hard, but enough constraints to make it bounded that you can work within guardrails. And I think it's a perfect space to really see tremendous upside for I think both carriers and shippers. So that's what we're betting. That's what you're betting on too.
Agree. Yeah. When you think of all the big factors that go into the LTL network, it's people, it's energy, through fuel, it's real estate, it's technology. Those are any industry within, or any company operating within one of those categories is tricky enough. Is the stack and the combination and the compounding effect of all those things where it can either go really right or really wrong. But yeah, that's what stands out to me as AI and technology and people driving that, over the coming years, find ways to get more energy efficient and get faster and more accurate with technology. And I don't know the answer on the real estate problem. There's only so much land in key markets, but
you a lot of money.
There are a lot of things, that directly impact the LTL experience that are going to be, I think, quickly improving in the next few years.
Curtis, thank you. Yeah, man, that's what the show's all about. I really appreciate having you.
Thank you.
For those listening, you can find us at withjunction.com. Follow us on LinkedIn. If you have a story we're sharing, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to have you on. This was our first one, so we'll see how this edits out and how it all worked. And Curtis, thank you for being a guinea pig, and thank you for being my friend. And thank you for being our partner, and love all the things you're doing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be the guinea pig. Happy to be a friend. You're somebody that it's like we met about a year ago. We're both in our 40s. It feels like, we probably could have met 20 years ago, and I don't know what that would have looked like, but yeah, we were meant to meet at some point. So I appreciate what you're doing as well, and you having me on here. And once you go through a few other guests, maybe you'll have me back, and we can.
Yeah, when we get this thing rolled.
No.
Okay, man. See ya. Have a great long weekend, and yeah, man, be well.
All right. Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.